March 25th, 2016, the opening night of Batman v Superman. It might have been half a decade ago now, but I remember it clearly. The screening was packed, the trailers finished, and after months of great anticipation from myself and many others, the film began. Now, I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting it to be like. Bear in mind I hadn't seen Man of Steel at that point, but even if I had, I don't think I would have been prepared for what this movie had in store. It was marketed to look exactly like what the title suggested, whilst the final product had a lot more on its mind than just pitting two icons against each other. I was very taken aback, but after a while, and I didn't entirely know why at the time, I realized I was loving it. Even though I couldn't 100% understand the whys of what was happening, I was caught up in the visceral power of how it was told. My Batman-obsessed self grinned like an idiot when the Batmobile showed up, was blown away by the incredible action, and I vividly recall how searing the tension was in certain scenes. All it took was a couple of seconds for a moment to skyrocket my adrenaline. I was caught up by how unexpectedly story-driven it was, and seeing how the titular conflict was presented through Lex Luthor's manipulations was incredibly thrilling to me. There were a few times where I wanted to do it, but in particular the moment after Lex has Superman manipulated on the helipad to fight Batman and he's getting into the helicopter with the score blaring, I was in absolute awe, and I very nearly whispered to my dad, "This is brilliant." But I'm glad I didn't, as he wound up hating the movie. I was floored by it, but hearing those less enthusiastic reactions from both him and my sister on the drive home, whilst not being able to properly articulate why I was so gripped, was strange. I spent most of the time sitting there thinking, why do the critics hate this? I bet everyone in the theatre right now is loving it as much as I am. So realizing that they probably didn't, I think I put myself in denial about how I really felt. I'd also just only started reviewing things at the time, so when it came to doing an unscripted ramble about it, I essentially tricked myself into liking it less.
It's a very good one, or just a good movie, but when you really think about it, it's a very flawed and almost cluttered film.
Oh, that video is annoying to watch now. I disagree with so much of it after many rewatches, as well as seeing the superior extended cut. But I dare say it was a transformative movie-going experience. I've become a lot more willing to stick to my own gut feeling, and I'm also a lot better at putting those feelings into words now. And yet the atmosphere this film conjures up continues to leave me overwhelmed by its raw, visceral power every time. Dawn of Justice is unlike any comic book film I have seen and probably ever will see, even with the likes of Man of Steel and Justice League tying into it. This still feels one of a kind, presenting a gritty hyper-reality where governmental espionage debacles coexist with superhero fantasy effortlessly. But for all the moments of darkness, which I do love, I don't think the Ultimate Edition gets enough credit for its personality during the moments which spend time exploring extra avenues of this world. Small parts which segue into key moments adds the charm people craved in the theatrical release, and the highlighting of the little people in this tale of caped heroes, monsters and masterminds in these bits and Clark's investigations is one of the many ways BVS stands out amongst other superhero movies. Speaking of which, I really like all the James Bond-esque sleuth work, expanding the world further with lavish parties where the alter egos take a break from their snooping to butt heads using sly dialogue. The seductiveness of Bruce and Diana's head-to-head in particular, with the elegant camera work, that dress, and the eyes wide shut music in the background makes that scene a real standout. Having moments like that work in tandem with the later blockbuster action is a testament to how well the filmmaking keeps everything on the same page. And putting that aside, the craft on display in general is just terrific. The cinematography, amazing, and as darkly beautiful as it is bold. Many shots are like panels from a comic book sprung into motion, yet the graininess of the visuals grounds this world of stylized, potentially silly images into a realm of tangibility. No matter how bombastic things get towards the end, there's always a sense of weight intact, sustained further by the phenomenal score which pierces through the soul of the story to make every moment feel that much more massive and impactful. The music here is some of my favourite ever composed for a film. The grandeur, emotion, and the otherworldly ethereal quality of the orchestrations flawlessly embodies the aura behind every scene they accompany, working alongside the energetic camera movements in complete harmony to make even smaller moments unforgettably thrilling. It's the execution of such moments which makes some of the DCEU setups kind of work in context of this world. It's not about what they're implying, it's how they imply it. The ominous transition into the nightmare sequence sets up the uneasy tension of this intermission of sorts, which can work within the context of this story as a look at Batman's fear of Superman shown with real brute force in this awesome long take fight scene. It has a visceral quality which makes it a great scene, and personally speaking, it doesn't disrupt the flow and ambiance of the rest of the film. Keep in mind, I'm not overly enthused at the idea of cinematic universes. For context, I think Infinity War and Endgame are terrific, but I wasn't so keen on the several 2-hour films of brief setups I had to sit through beforehand. They dragged being detached from the initial hype. So I like how BVS isn't set up by 5 other movies or split into several. It cuts straight to the main event as something which works as a singular story even when it paves the way for more. Remember, it's dealing with characters who have been household names for a lot longer than the majority of the Marvel crew. We all know Batman's origin story, so instead of establishing this version through yet another film, we're presented with a stunning rendition of the Wayne's death for the opening credits, before being introduced to the character at a later and darker state, with further backstory being implied and suggested through small moments, and the history Ben Affleck and Jeremy Irons masterfully communicate through their chemistry. It's refreshing to jump straight to Bruce as a figure disillusioned with his initial purpose. Having an unestablished Batman makes for an interesting contrast with the Superman we got to know through Man of Steel, and watching both in close proximity made me notice that it's kind of brilliant how BVS shows the ground perspective of Man of Steel's climax to establish the central dilemma here. That film was focused on Clark Kent's inner journey in becoming Superman. Most of it is told from his point of view, with only one scene alerting humanity to the presence of aliens. We, the audience, were shown the final battle between Superman and Zod to be a personal conflict, but here the events are detached from the internal stakes for an objective look at the damage dealt to Metropolis, and with the title card proclaiming this is mankind's introduction to Superman, it makes the ensuing vitriol aimed towards him understandable. Civil War deals with similar ideas and imagery, but for me, BVS commits to the grit necessary to convey the impact and weight a situation like this would have on the world, and particularly those caught in the crossfire. Having Bruce Wayne be a part of it is the icing on the cake, a great setup for his crusade against the idea of an all-powerful being. We know the image of Superman to be an icon of hope, but having been thrust into a world which of course would judge and be intimidated by his inhuman abilities, it's seen as one of destruction, and so begins the larger battle of the story. This film is essentially a modern take on Watchmen, a story of superheroes being examined by the media, which has only gotten more relevant as pop culture's treatment of them has evolved. Every time a new superhero movie comes out, I see countless articles on how accurate to the source material they are, the details you missed, how the actors felt filming. These movies are scrutinized by the masses more so than any other kind of blockbuster. Even the tiniest elements will be debated endlessly on social media. People complained Superman wasn't rightly utilized in this movie in a fascinatingly similar manner to how the media and the world of the film question how Superman should utilize his power. In both cases, it's not the ideal version of what people want this image to be, and so begin the debates. It's easy to be susceptible to media frenzy, and even easier to distort mindsets through it. It's kind of ironic how the theatrical version shows the African woman's testimony, i.e. what the public sees, but leaves out the part where she reveals Lex Luthor forced her to lie, information which doesn't get out to the rest of the world. Because of that, the shorter film is about how Superman is affected by the media, the longer and better version makes it about the manipulation of it at the hands of a puppet master.
They haven't ruled out the idea that Superman was a co-conspirator. Now, my sources are telling me they're getting a barrage of anonymous and credible tips, with all roads in this investigation leading to the Kryptonian visitor.
Ever since my first viewing, I've loved Jesse Eisenberg's divisive portrayal of Lex Luthor. His little quirks, like how you can tell he's rehearsed his monologues and absolutely relishes the authority he gains over everyone else, to how he puts on this facade as this gregarious rich kid are so great, and his falsification of Superman's image amid controlling so much of how the narrative plays out is riveting. We never get so much as a glimpse of his often mentioned father, but we hear him to have used his son negatively both literally
No man in the sky intervened when I was a boy to deliver me from Daddy's fists and abominations.
and otherwise.
No, Dad started saying that he named the company after his kid at investor pitches. Rich old ladies, they thought it was very cute, you know. Write checks for Lex.
The mental hold is clearly present, his disdain for higher establishments a little too strong, and once this godlike figure enters the picture, he has the ultimate power to aim his rage at and take control of to satisfy his traumatized ego. Seeing this nerdy, socially awkward figure accumulate all this power and dominance over the hierarchy of gods and men through the most intricately planned and diabolical means is compelling stuff, especially when you see all the strands with his fingerprints on come together just before the Capitol bombing. Bruce finding the notes, Lois uncovering how the murders in Africa were staged, Senator Finch being told about Lex's plans, then immediately coming into contact with him, the news covering Superman's arrival, the way it jumps back and forth between these is absolutely gripping. And then the moment where it does explode and further develops the titular fight is so rewarding from a narrative standpoint, getting the intimacy in Superman's reaction to the tragedy, what no one else sees, before cutting to what everyone sees, the colossal damage further enveloping Bruce in his rage. It's a dramatic moment, but I can't help but find myself satisfied at how the Batman v Superman part of the story is interwoven with everything else. The first two acts are like a thriller, establishing the depth and torment lying at the core of these renditions of the characters, especially on Batman's end.
You don't even know if he exists. Could be a phantasm.
Love that reference to the best Batman movie, and it ties nicely into this with Alfred's end speech.
Vengeance blackens the soul, Bruce. I always feared you would become that which you fought against.
This version of the character has become exactly what that Alfred feared, a ruthless beast who no longer cares about moral codes and sparing those in his way. And even though the banter between Billionaire and Butler in this film is very entertaining, you can tell Bruce is world-weary during them. Mask of the Phantasm captured the tortured soul at the core of the character better than any of the live-action films, but Ben Affleck's take here is the closest one of them has come to replicating that tragic quality. He is also by far the most ferocious Batman when it comes to his fight scenes. Like, holy crap, he is a machine! All of the action in this movie is pretty friggin' epic, but it also highlights how far down the beaten track this Batman has gone. Lex's meddling plunging him deeper into this downward spiral, pushing the story further into conventional superhero movie territory. But when the action-orientated third act arrives, it's absolutely glorious because of the gravitas the rest of the film set up. The immersive nighttime backdrop sets the stage for where
The magical thinking of orphan boys.
finally manifests itself into the two titans duking it out. It's quite the spectacle, but not in a who will win way. Rather, it's the contrast between the one side hell-bent on eradicating what he perceives to be the image of mass destruction against the other who is merely attempting to subdue him to save his mother. It, of course, climaxes in the infamous Martha moment, which I'm not going to explain for those who don't like it. There's been plenty of great defenses for it being a powerful moment, bringing the ideas of warped perspectives full circle. To me, it once again chips away at the tragedy of the character, forcing him to realize he's become no better than the man who killed his parents. Everything from here on out wonderfully parallels the beginning, and I'd like to observe that Bruce doesn't see his mother or himself in Clark, but rather, I think, Thomas Wayne. In their most vulnerable moment, both use force in an attempt to save their loved ones, even with their dying breath. His perception of this alien is suddenly given a humanity he can relate to, especially later when he sacrifices himself to protect the world who rejected his purpose. This is where the movie succeeds as a standalone piece. It's a second origin story for Batman. Frustrated confusion fades away into a crusade with a clear path, the trigger of which is selfless death and the subsequent funeral. And I know this is going to sound crazy, but within the context of this story, it doesn't matter whether or not Superman gets brought back to life. His death at the hands of an inherent evil reshapes how the world perceived him, finally understanding what he stood for. It's a very dark, downbeat film, but the way it ends on a fundamentally optimistic note makes it all the more poignant when the world finally sees the value in Superman as a symbol of hope. He might be gone and Lex may hint at a future threat, but mankind is re-inspired and we know Bruce and Diana will prepare themselves for what may come. A perfect reminder of how influential these icons can be. Superman doesn't need to return because his legacy lives on. And even though I really enjoyed Zack Snyder's Justice League, Batman v Superman still stands alone as a special culmination of the dignity the Dark Knight trilogy showed for the genre, the examination of comic book characters molded into images found in Joker, the intertwining IPs of the MCU, and the exciting thrill of any good blockbuster. I'll always gravitate towards anything all-encompassing, which is exactly why I find the style of this 3-hour behemoth utterly irresistible. Every crazy, exhilarating and intriguing moment feels big, making for a lofty epic of the superhero genre which, for sheer ambition, remains and will probably continue to remain unmatched.